Ele deu ok, começa? Boa tarde a todos e todas, é um prazer tê-los aqui. Hoje, dando prosseguimento à nossa agenda dos seminários do Departamento de Ciência Política, temos o prazer de receber o professor Aleksandr Sherstobitov, da Universidade Estadual de São-Petersburgo, que fará uma apresentação sobre a pesquisa que ele conduz aqui na condição de pesquisador visitante no Instituto de Relações Internacionais da USP, sob o título Os Limites do Controle, redes de patrocínio legislativo e as estratégias individuais dos legisladores nos parlamentos autoritários. Então, o professor Aleksandr vai proferir a palestra sobre o tema de pesquisa dele e, após a palestra, a gente abre para perguntas e comentários. Então, agradeço mais uma vez a presença de todos e todas e passo a palavra para o professor Aleksandr. Please, professor, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you for receiving me here. I will present my current research. It's in progress. However, I have already some preliminary results, and I will tell you about these results of exploratory analysis, and I will also try to a little bit elaborate on what's going on next and what I'm going to do in my further work. So actually I'm in political and policy networks area, and this project is dedicated, it is funded by FAPSP, and it is dedicated to the development of theoretical framework of network analysis of authoritarian parliaments, and my specific focus is on co-sponsorship networks in authoritarian parliaments. So, in what aspects we in political science can use network approach to study the legislatures? We can build networks, network maps, and analyze networks of different interactions of the members of parliament, and we can use different criteria, different indicators to outline these networks and then to analyze them. For instance, on this slide you can see different indicators that we may use as the criteria to build networks, for instance, here you can see voting patterns or different institutional ties and so on. And actually, in my work, I use co-sponsorship networks. So when deputies, members of parliament, when they co-sponsor the bill for us, this is an indicator of tie between them. And we can weight these ties and so on. I will elaborate a little bit further on this when I go further. So actually a lot has been done by political scientists in this area. There are a lot of different studies dedicated to co-sponsorship networks in parliaments. For instance, on this slide you can see different examples, different studies published in journals regarding the policy network, political networks or sponsorship networks in parliaments. However, almost all of these studies were dedicated to the analysis of co-sponsorship networks in parliaments in democracies. But what about authoritarian parliaments? So the mainstream in political science says that the mainstream ideas is that authoritarian parliaments or parliaments in authoritarian settings decide nothing. So these are just the institutions that legitimize the policies that are elaborated somewhere else, usually by dictator or authoritarian elites, and parliaments are just to legitimize the policies. Or, for example, very often such kind of parliament, Russian parliament, in many studies and many published papers, is called rubber stamp. So just the members of parliaments are kind of soldiers who just stamp the bills that are developed by president's administration, which is considered in contemporary Russia, which is considered to be the center of political and policy decision making. However, I have some to entertain you. For instance, this is a caricature about so-called matte printer. In Russia, we call, not we political scientists, but many people call parliament as a matte printer. Something that prints bills. And for instance, for example, on this caricature, you see like the speaker says, dear colleagues, deputies, please try to remember what we have not banned yet. So, like, the parliament stamps the bills to ban everything in the country. Like, nothing, you can do nothing without violating the law. Or, for example, this meme. It's actually, this is a true story. This is a former speaker of State Duma, the lower chamber of Russian parliament, Boris Gryzlov. And once there were some discussions, some argues in Duma, and he was the speaker, and he said, "Colleagues, please stop. Parliament is not the place for discussions." Yeah, this is a true story. It's not an anecdote. So, what do they do in the parliament? We don't know, or maybe we know, and we want to go further and to see if there is any room for politics in parliaments in authoritarian settings. So yeah, here you can see the motivation for the study. Like our idea or our hypothesis, or our basic assumption is that there is room for some politics and policy making in even in authoritarian setting. Basically, this assumption relates to the dichotomy that there is no room for politics, but there is some room for policies. When it comes to political questions, the center of decision making is in president's administration, in executive branch of power. But when it comes to specific policy arenas, probably there is some room for collaboration of deputies, independent bills, and so on. Moreover, why do politicians want to be elected to become the members of the parliament? So probably they have their own strategies that they want to focus on when they are elected, and this is also politics. Yep. So on this slide you can see the. It's complicated, but I just decided to insert it because it's important to see that there are a lot of actors that can initiate the bills in the Russian Federation. So even the president may initiate the bills, the Council of Federation, or the deputies, members of the congressmen, the senators, the upper chamber, but also the regional parliaments may also initiate the bills and so on. And here on this slide, you can see, if you watch the line on members of the Council of Federation and deputies of State Duma, you see that they're quite active. They propose a lot of bills, and that is why it makes sense to study what they do and what kind of bills, and is there any co-sponsorship networks and the outcomes of this co-sponsorship. So here are the key questions that may contribute to theory. First of all, our idea is to know more, to learn more about authoritarian parliaments, and to see if authoritarian parliaments also are political institutions, but not just the soldiers or institutions of legitimation. And are there any coalitions or political coalitions? Do members of parliament establish stable ties between them, collaborate? Do they arrange coalitions, and what these coalitions stand for? And so on. It's very important to mention that when we use the network approach, the network approach in political science is a well-established methodology, and there is a lot of research using network analysis. However, the network analysis basically is focused on exploratory. The network approach is basically focused on exploratory analysis. So to learn more about the structures, the nodes, the ties, and so on. In my study, I also use the exploratory analysis as the basis for the further research. So the primary question here is what are the co-sponsorship networks, what are the nodes, what are the key indicators of these nodes, and how can we go then, because actually the most important here is the explanatory level of analysis, so to come to explanations. And here you can see the most important question that interests me. So is there a correspondence between the formation of co-sponsorship networks and the individual political strategies of the members of parliament here in Russian parliament? But I want, if it works well, if the methodology and the theoretical framework works well, I want to expand this framework to study other authoritarian parliaments. At least the next case study will be probably in Turkish parliament. So what is the data I use, and the method? So what is interesting, by the way, when we talk about Russian parliament, which is considered to be authoritarian, but the API is really well done, and it is really transparent. You can download all kind of data regarding the bills, the proposed bills, who proposed all the stages, and so on. So it works really well, and that is why we managed together with my colleagues from Higher School of Economics in Russia, in Moscow, we managed to code the tool to get all the information and to structure, to get the data and to structure the data for further network analysis. And we model several types of graphs, indirected graphs and directed graphs, because it's important to say, because in different parliaments it works in different way. In Russian parliament, the sequence of co-authors makes sense. So in some parliaments, they're just in the alphabetical order. In Russian parliament, the sequence of co-authors makes sense. That is why we also decided to make the directed graph, where the first person will be the incoming node, and all others will establish the out linkages. Yep, and the first test of the methodology was on 7th convocation of State Duma, so the previous one, not this one, the previous one. Yeah, this is just short explanation of what exponential random graph modeling is. So it works not like we very often in who is in quantitative methods. We can use different statistical modeling in political science and in political research. In network studies, it's very different from the traditional regression analysis. So ERGM model is basically the model where it's the probabilistic model. So the tool calculates the probability of establishing the nodes from 1 to 1, so it requires a lot of resources, and the data for 7th convocation, it took about 10 days for the computer to calculate everything. So just inputted data and then waited for almost 10 days. To calculate the data, to map the graphs, and to calculate different parameters. So here are the hypotheses for exploratory analysis. There are 6 of them. They're very interconnected, of course, and so you can read this hypothesis. So actually the most important here was to see what are the predictors to establish the ties. Usually in such kind of studies, the researchers use such indicators as age, gender, faction, committee, region that members of parliament represent, and so on. So we also outline these criteria to see if some of these indicators maybe, or some of these attributes of the nodes of the members of parliament may be the predictors for establishment of co-sponsorship ties. So here is the network of co-sponsorship. You can see it's quite dense. So there were a lot of bills represented. There were a lot of co-sponsorship ties regarding each bill. So actually, there was, I don't remember, but as far as I remember, there was any bill without co-sponsorship. So all the bills were co-sponsored. So you can see on this map that the co-sponsorship network is really dense. However, I also did this. So I tried to, I used the binarization algorithm to see the binary ties between deputies, and you see that if we use the binary ties equal or more than 10, the network map is more clusterized, and it's important. Then I will tell a few words about that when I go to the discussion of the results. So the preliminary results show that members of parliament tend to co-sponsor the bills of their counterparts representing the same faction or committee. It's quite banal. However, there are some specific aspects that I will mention as far as I remember on the next slide. And at the same time, there is no evidence of co-sponsorship homophily when it comes to such legislative attributes as gender, age, or electoral districts or regions that deputies represent. This is quite different from what we usually see in the studies of parliaments and democracies. But we can explain this, especially regarding the electoral districts or regions. Very often, deputies who are elected in some electoral districts or in some regions, they do not belong to these regions, so they're just were elected in the lists in these regions, but they never lived there. That is why there is no tie between there are no ties between two deputies that are elected in the same electoral district. So it's quite clear to us why this happened. Also, the weighted networks represent dense collaboration. Yep. Although when we implement the binarization procedures, so we eliminate the big ties, and it appears that inter-faction co-sponsorship cliques are established. So it's also very important. So there are cliques inside each faction. There are cliques. So very, very dense collaboration of some deputies, of some members of parliament inside the faction. So in any faction, except Just Russia Party, which is rather small, in all other factions there are inner faction clusters. On this slide, the results of ERGM, exponential random graph modeling, and what is interesting here. So, you see faction match is important, even before the cutoff, but also the reciprocity is very important, and I will elaborate a little bit further on this. There is no, on this slide there is no, there is no such criteria, but one interesting point is that the floor of the office of the member of parliament is also a good predictor. There is the building, the parliament, there are different floors, and the members of parliament have offices on different floors, and the floor is the good predictor of establishing the ties. So when when members of parliament offices are situated on the same floor, it's a good predictor that they will establish co-sponsorship ties. It's very interesting to explain. So probably it's not for political science, it's more for anthropology. When we talked to the assistants of, when I talked to assistants of members of parliament, they say, well, I go out for a smoke or for coffee with those who are next door. And that is why when my boss asks me to find someone to sponsor the bill, I go to these friends. So it's, of course, it's also a political science question, but it's more about anthropology of doing things in regular life of people who are involved in the decision making. What is also interesting, but actually we see that reciprocity is important here, and I will tell a few words about reciprocity. So what are the strategies? I managed to identify 4 different strategies that needs to be checked whether I'm right or not, whether these strategies really occur, whether these strategies are those that members of parliament are focused on. So the first one, the legislators tend to increase their centrality, all kinds of centrality, so between centrality, closeness centrality, eigenvector centrality, all kinds of centralities are the incentives to be increased by the deputies. So they always want to increase their centrality. How to increase the centrality? To co-sponsor the bills of the most central actor, of the most central deputy, the one who develops more bills, but also the one who has a lot of other ties already. So this is a very interesting strategy, and we see that very often members of parliament just co-sponsor the bills of the most central actors, so they also tend to increase their centrality. Second, about the reciprocity. So the reciprocity actually seems to be very, very important, I call it incentive, for establishing the co-sponsorship ties. So what does it mean? It means that if the deputy wants to gain social capital, and there is also one more hypothesis about that, the deputy tends to establish co-sponsorship ties, to co-sponsor someone's bills, then to get the favor of the other member of parliament to co-sponsor his or her bills in future. So this reciprocity is a very important incentive. But why? Why do they do this? This is because the co-sponsorship for bills, or for political bills, is a question of trade, to be co-sponsored when presenting bills in other specific policy arenas. So the members of parliament, they co-sponsor the political bills which are developed in the president's administration and are, for example, presented by some deputy or some deputies in the parliament, and all others could sponsor it to have the reciprocity in future, so that others, these politically oriented members of parliament, would co-sponsor other bills in some social policy or some specific economic policy arena, like metallurgy, oil and gas, or whatever. So this is a real strategy that we can identify. However, this is the basis for the next hypothesis to be tested. One more important strategy is that the most active members of parliament, who tend to co-sponsor as more bills as they can, they use this to gain social capital, to get start for the further career in executive branch of power. And I can trace a lot of these career paths when members of parliament use parliamentary activity as a start to their career in executive branch of power, in president's administration or in regional branches, executive branches of power. So I'm going to the end of my presentation, which is very short, like 30 minutes. So actually, these are the results of exploratory level of analysis, but my key point is to go further and to explain why the deputies, why the members of parliament use different strategies. And now I'm working on the development of a mixed framework where I mix the network analysis with the game theory. I really like the Milgram's idea. He got the Nobel Prize for auctions theory, but he also has at least one paper regarding use of this auction theory for analysis of parliaments, and maybe it will work. So this is a mechanism design theory, and regarding these strategies, I think it will be possible to model the interactions of trade of the social capital and political capital in order to follow the strategies of that members of parliament have. One more step, and I already started to get this data, the discourse network analysis. So at this point, discourse network analysis is the two-mode network analysis. So I have the first mode, the co-sponsorship network. The second mode will be the political discourse. So what members of parliament say in public. I have already assembled the data on their public speeches in parliament and in mass media. Now I'm together with my colleague from UK. We're working on the tool to structure this data, and this will be the structured data for the second mode. So, and we will link the co-sponsorship networks and networks of concepts that members of parliament say in public, and we'll see how it works. We assemble data regarding oil and gas policy and regarding gender issues. We'll see if it works. Maybe we'll try to get also some other data about some speeches about other policy arenas. And if everything works well, I'm going to go further and to expand this theoretical framework to study other authoritarian parliaments and maybe make some kind of comparative analysis and so on, so to contribute to theory of authoritarian regimes and specifically parliaments in authoritarian settings. Well, I think that's it. 30 minutes. Thank you.
Obrigado, professor Aleksandr. Então, abrimos para perguntas. Fiquem à vontade.
Students first.
Thank you for the lecture. When you said about the network built because of the flow, of the distribution of the MPs among the floors, I remember that when I worked at a company, we moved from one building to another, and we saw that the more powerful people got to get next to the windows because they were more powerful, and the other ones were not close to the windows. So I was thinking when you said this potential explanation for networks, is there any criterion to distribute the MPs among the floors of the parliament?
Thank you. It's quite easy. Those who are incumbents, those who already had offices, they maintain their offices. The new members of parliament get the offices randomly. So those who were in the previous convocation, they stay in the same offices. All others get it randomly. So that is why very often two members of different factions may have offices close to each other. But sometimes, they can, if they have enough political, like someone who has some political capital, significant political capital, he or she may ask for the better office with better windows, better views and so on. But it happens, but not very often. Usually, it's just the random. Yeah, but this is interesting. They get officers randomly, but then their assistants become friends.
Good evening, Professor Aleksandr. Thank you for our lecture. I would like to ask about your next research projects on comparative authoritarian regimes, especially because the main example that is Russia is a regime the constitutional institutions were first built in the 90s in the model of democratic republics, and then the authoritarian, as your pre-paper told you, the following years were of increasingly more authoritarianism. Sorry. But you have other regimes, authoritarian regimes, such as the People's Republic of China, in which the framework was built with a legislative body, but from the beginning didn't have this kind of analogy to other democratic republics. And I'd like to ask if your your future projects of research consider these differences of origin of the legislative body and how the current literature suggests that what kinds of differences would be between representatives in current Russian Duma compared to the National Assembly of the People's Republic of China or analogous bodies, for example. Thank you.
Yeah, this is a tricky question. So the idea is to take, for instance, Turkey and Azerbaijan, the countries that also have comparatively nice API, and to make to use the RGM algorithms also for comparison, and then, of course, the context will be the political context will be kind of some of variables that will be explanatory ones. So the idea is to test the hypothesis on the exploratory level, and then when compare, use also the differences in authoritarian setting, because all authoritarian countries are very, very different. You know Leo Tolstoy? Yep. Anna Karenina starts with the sentence that all happy families are the same. All unhappy families are different. So all the democracies probably are rather similar, but all authoritarian regimes are very, very different. Yep. So it makes sense. I mean, your question makes sense. It's very tricky.
Thank you.
Hello, Professor. Thank you for the lecture. I was wondering, like, under dictatorship, like when you don't have much room for ideologies to be expressed, how do this co-sponsorship works amongst maybe counter ideologies? So here in Brazil, we had last year a very marked division between left and right, and I was wondering, how did it work in Russia? And for your further studies, are you willing to include other variables such as gender, maybe ethnicity or race, to understand how these relations work in probably different contexts, and if you are considering studying the Brazilian context as well?
Yeah, thank you. I will answer the second question. It's easy. Yeah, I want to use ethnicity also as one of the predictors, and to test if ethnicity works. However, my hypothesis is that it never works in Russia, but I will test it. Yeah, thank you. The second, about ideologies. Well, the Russian Parliament is the institution where the parties that are elected, they have ideologies, but this is a kind of facade. For many for most of members of parliament, parliamentary activity, legislative activity is the business. That is why I use, and this is my justification. Of course, I will in my paper I will elaborate more on this, and that is why I try to use game theory modeling and the theory of auctions, because it's more about business. I know several assistants of members of parliament. And in informal speech, they say they are assistants. They are not members of parliament, but they are assistants of members of parliament. And I know several of them who just bought this position. They have business somewhere else. I mean, in Moscow region, they paid money to become the assistant of the member of parliament, and they do not work as an assistant. They use this as a document to enter the building of State Duma and to do their own business. The same is with many deputies, both in, especially in lower chamber in State Duma. In upper chamber, in Council Federation, it's a bit different, but it is also like rather similar. A bit different, but for most of senators, it is also kind of business.
Sorry, just if I may, a quick follow-up. What about gender? Like, do you consider...
we tested gender. I showed...
would you... what's the proportion of women in Russian parliament, and is it increasing in the recent years?
It's increasing. There are no quotas. But yeah, it's increasing. It's increasing both. It's increasing in federal parliament, in regional parliaments, and it is even more significant in executive branch of power. However, it's not 50-50, of course. I do not have the exact data. I think about 20% of members of parliament are female. Yeah, we tested gender is not the predictor for establishing the co-sponsorship ties. That is why I think ethnicity will not also work here. But yeah, this is a good idea to test. Yeah, that's it. No more questions. Most of the deputies have companies. They have business. Of course, this is according to the law, they cannot have business. But their wives, husbands, kids, aunts, uncles, all of them have business. So being a member of parliament is the way to promote the strategies of the business.
Thank you for your presentation, very interesting. I was wondering, first, is there any relation between co-sponsorship and approval of the bills? Because if there's not a strong correlation, that means that they do not get together because any calculations on the effects on the approval of the bills. Then the second question is, do you think there is a kind of calculation related to the production of social capital? In what sense? Because at the beginning it could be informal. I mean, you're lost. You just get in one place that is empty, then you get involved with the people, and then you will start this co-sponsorship. But if the thing is making business, then making calculations on the way you can produce social capital could be a good choice for ordering the co-sponsorship. So I was wondering if it's about anthropology, in terms of it just happens because they are together, or there is some calculation on producing these kinds of relations because they're gonna give them advantages for making business?
Yeah, thank you so much. For the first question, the betweenness centrality and closeness centrality scores are good predictors of whether bills are adopted or not. The higher between the centrality or closeness centrality of the node, of the member of the deputy of parliament, the higher probability is that the bills that this person represents are adopted in the long run. However, there are a lot of stalemate. Here I mentioned this. There are a lot of stalemate situations, and my hypothesis is also that we can use the auction theory to see in what situations stalemate occurs. So yeah, there are a lot of them. We can use this veto players terminology and framework, but actually those who have the highest betweenness and closeness and eigenvector centrality scores, they are the veto actors in the parliament. Regarding the social capital, yeah, it appears that the deputies, when they are elected and they start to co-sponsor as more bills as they can in order to get this kind of social capital and ERGM modeling, especially if we divide the convocation, for example, for four periods, 4 years, or 4 sessions, so 8 or now 10 sessions each convocation. RGM modeling shows that there are some members of parliament, some nodes that increase their centrality scores, and this is a significant feature of those who come to State Duma to increase their social capital. Yeah. I mean, I try to when I make interpretations of why they do this. Yeah, I say my assumption is that they're increasing their strategies to increase the social capital.
Did you interview the deputies or not? It's dangerous. In second, please. You use faction. Factions and parties are the same thing or not?
The second question at first. Usually they're the same, but there are some members of parliament that change the faction during the convocation period. Sometimes they change the faction, not very often, but it happens. And using ERGM, dividing the convocation into sessions, for instance, is very good to purify the data in this case. Regarding the interviews, no, I talked informally a lot. But I cannot use this in research to follow the ethics of the research, so I would say no, I haven't interviewed them. However, I talked a lot with assistants, with members of deputies, members of parliament before, and to find some explanations. But of course, I cannot use this in the research, in papers, as the justified data. So the answer is no.
Aleksandr, there is a growing literature stating that the audience costs of authoritarian regimes are as high as democratic regimes. So do you have an intention to include public opinion perceptions? For example, are there more co-sponsorship when the problem is more sensitive to public opinion in Russia?
Very good question. I didn't think about this. it will make the model even more complicated. But maybe further for kind of discussion or further explanations, maybe it makes sense to do that. The problem here is with the polls in authoritarian setting. Can we trust polls in authoritarian setting? I'm not sure. I mean, I'm sure we cannot trust results of polls to public opinion in authoritarian setting. For example, the recent polls, not recent, so the polls since the beginning of 2022 in Russia, some companies show the refusal rate, and it is more than 90%. So when people are asked about the war, do they support the war, or do they support Putin? More than 90% refuse to give the answer. And then people see in mass media, 75% of Russians support Putin and support war. 75% of less than 10% who answered this question. This is the right answer. So it's very complicated to justify this data, especially if you want to publish. If I want to publish this research in the journal, the first question of the reviewer will be, can you justify the use of this data? And I cannot. However, the idea is makes sense for sure.
Última oportunidade. Então, pessoal, agradeço a presença de todos e todas. Principalmente agradeço o professor Aleksandr pela apresentação super interessante, uma ótima contribuição para o nosso debate, e vejo a todos vocês no próximo seminário do DCP em 15 dias. Obrigado.
Muito obrigado.